Hi everyone, welcome to another BAPT In Conversation with webinar. I'm Richard Owen, the current treasurer of the BAPT, that's the British Association for Psychological Type. We're a membership organisation. We're here to promote knowledge and best practice with psychological type. We run a conference here in the UK. This year's one is online to mark the centenary of Carl Jung's Psychological Types. It's going to be a really interesting event, all virtual in April this year. If you're interested in knowing more, go to bapt.org.uk. You can also become a member of BAPT for not very much money every year, and also, get our magazine and discounts on events and that kind of thing. It's been a while now. We've been running these in conversations, and I've been meaning to have our guest today on for a while now, because he's been running a successful business in psychological type for about 6 or 7 years. He's based in the US. He's got a business called TypeCoach. I'm going to ask him to explain a bit more about what that is. I'd just like to welcome him now. That's Rob Toomey. Hi, Rob.
Hi, Richard. Thank you for having me. Good to be here.
Yeah, it's great to have you here as a guest. Can you just quickly explain what is TypeCoach and what does it do?
Sure. Yeah. So TypeCoach, we sort of like to think of it as a communication platform. So there's a suite of online tools that allow people to go through a learning experience to clarify their best fit type, and then a bunch of resources that allow them to use it in the context of communication primarily. So there's one tool on there that allows people to get access to communication advice. So if I'm an ENTP working with an INTJ, Richard, it will spit out the top 10 things for me to keep in mind when dealing with someone of a very different type, to sort of take the guesswork out of that process. And there's other resources on the site in terms of coaching videos for each type. And we've actually recorded our whole online course in Watford, as a matter of fact. And that's available on the site as well.
Excellent. And so when people do this, what forms does it take? I know you've got a verifier, and what's involved in that?
Yeah, so it's sort of a counter-intuitive approach to helping people understand personality types. So rather than a psychometric approach where you're doing a series of questions and the participant isn't really understanding what it is that the questions are after, we flipped it around and really tried to recreate the one-to-one best fit verification conversation. So we used essentially the same script that we would if we were sitting down with someone to help them verify their best fit type, and then paired that with animations and videos that sort of illuminate the scenarios that people would sort of commonly be exposed to say, all right, am I more on the sensing side or more on the intuition side? There's a validation process where they're reading multiple descriptions, and then finally they sort out to their best fit type and they receive a report. Also counter to the sort of historical or traditional approach, they get the report from the system prior to some form of facilitated program, which gives them a chance to read it, absorb it, come in prepared for questions. And I was saying to Richard beforehand, I try to not take credit for things out of turn. We didn't anticipate that was going to be a massive benefit for the introverts, but in fact, they're coming into the sessions now far more sort of excited to participate because they have had a chance to sort of absorb and process the information beforehand.
So basically, the system takes them through a process on the computer on their own, so they can verify their own type, in a bit similar to what we do in the feedback process with type and MBTI, for instance. So you've kind of taken some of what practitioners were doing and automated it, and then, as you were saying, freed up time so that they can then do the application stage of it.
Yeah, I mean, selfishly for us, the difficulty in facilitating a program where there's no pre-work is the participants are not familiar with the terminology. And so you have to do a lot of housekeeping at the beginning to say, judging doesn't mean judgmental, perceiving doesn't mean perceptive, and do all the sort of explanatory piece around the terminology. That's not what I think the most valuable thing for practitioners to do with their time in front of the group. So if you can get all of that done beforehand, then we actually, as a group of practitioners, become more valuable, because we're now talking about, okay, so here's where the friction emerges between thinking types and feeling types. And everyone's going to come along with you on that journey because they're familiar with what those terms mean.
I know we talked about this before. The feedback, when you created this, this automated system that did some of the work that practitioners were doing, Like, what was the response? What did you get back from the community?
It's interesting, right? So this was kind of when we first started to see online quizzes. One of the first impulses that people had was, "Oh, it's another free quiz," and we're not. So we're only making this available to people who are going to have some form of facilitated session. So it's not designed for, except in rare cases, to be a standalone. So that put a lot of the practitioner concern at ease. And again, the goal is to make the practitioner more valuable in the session. So there's a hunger for the practitioners who, if you think back 10, 12 years, the practitioners had a lot more time devoted to getting across the principles of type. And now that's been compressed and compressed and compressed. And so there's not as much time left for the application piece, where the practitioners themselves report to us, feeling, I feel like I left them a little bit short on what we could have covered had we had more time. So I'm trying to buy them that time back. And also, I think, try to get the client organizations to understand there's a lot more to this than simply getting the 4-letter code for yourself and then moving on.
So in your work with companies, what kind of areas of intervention and application are you tending to work with?
So it's funny. So like any good consultant, the goal is to go in and listen and hear what their major concerns are. And then I'm trying to create alignment with a major business sort of priority, something that the organization has said, we need to do this. And it ranges, because sometimes the effort is we need to become more emotionally intelligent. We're not providing great customer care. We're having massive conflicts. Or we need to have more cognitive diversity. We need to incorporate more viewpoints. We have a lot of X personality types, and they're making decisions a certain way, and we need to integrate different perspectives into that conversation. And in all cases, the conversation then comes to, all right, well, would introducing a system that provides a common language to sort of allow everyone to articulate what those differences look like, and that provides simple communication advice to sort of bridge those gaps, would that be helpful? And the answer is most of the time, yes. So we can align with most of the sort of business priorities by touching on that communication element. If we can fix that, then there's urgency and relevance.
And I know that we titled this webinar Influence and Communication. So the influence part, what is it, that word influence, in what context do you mean that?
Yeah, it's a good question. Influence is one of those things where what we really mean is making sure that the other person's really fully hearing your message, that you're transmitting on the frequency that they receive on. All right, so if you and I are both in the intuitive spectrum, how can we translate this fuzzy vision for what might be down the road into tangible things that our sensing colleagues and friends can actually put their hands on, and translate it into a series of steps that will make this something that actually could happen, the how part of the conversation. And good communicators are adept at making that flex. They see the blank stare, or they see the confusion, and they're like, all right, let me say it a different way and see if I can get it across. So we're just trying to make that transition to the correct approach more quick and effective.
So for my type, for instance, INTJ, how might you approach communicating with me?
Well, so I would want to honor the introverted intuition, right? And say, Richard, we're going to talk on Friday, so I'm going to send you some discussion questions on Wednesday that I'd like you to put some thought in, so that when we have the conversation on Friday, you've been able to synthesize a wide range of different things that your brain prefers to synthesize, and the conversation will become much more rich. Other things like, in the conversation, I bring down the pace and create as much space as I can for you to feel comfortable participating. As an extrovert, this is something I have to watch out for, which is, a half second of silence for most extroverts feels uncomfortable, and we start to feel the need to fill that space. And a lot of INTJs say, I need a second or two to sort of absorb what you've just said before I can fire off the next piece that I'm liking to say. So if I can create a little bit of extra space for that, then hopefully I've done you benefits.
Yeah, and you also work with your wife, right, Carly? It's your
yes.
You run the business together. How do your two personalities kind of play off each other if you're running events?
So we first learned, and this is a good rule, I think it's a universal rule if you're going to work with your spouse, that separation of powers is key. So I'm in charge of certain parts of the business, and she's in charge of certain parts of the business, because if you're both involved in everything, it's a mess. And that's not just because of the personality similarities or differences. When we do crossover and when we have to collaborate on things, which is, pretty much every day, she's ESTJ to ENTP over here. So there's some pretty substantial differences both in type and temperament. My goal is to push things forward and to seek innovation and new, and her goal is to be responsible and make sure that we're not losing things. We call her, loss prevention. So I create an opportunity and she kicks into gear to say, how can we make sure we don't lose it? Which is a powerful combination from a business owner perspective, but it does create friction. Her goal for responsibility, given her temperament, and my goal for innovation are often at odds. And if we don't recognize that, then it's just open war. But if we can say, all right, so what are the benefits to each of those two perspectives and how can we integrate them? We often end up in a better place than either of us would have independently.
Mm. I guess
I make it sound very nice, but it's not always that nice.
Yeah, it's an interesting combination with those. Do you get a sort of how do introverted thinking and extroverted thinking kind of come at odds with each other?
Yeah, so it's funny that you go right to that. So that's our biggest challenge, is that Carly wants to talk through the problem solving and analysis, and I want to think it through on my own, right? So introverted thinking is my second, and it's extroverted thinking is her first, for those of you tracking. And so I don't verbalize that analysis nearly as well as she does. And I've had to recognize that often I simply need to create the space for her to verbalize without even participating myself in it, for her to get through that thought process. And she's learned that with especially pretty nuanced or complicated analyses, giving me some space for that to go away and reflect on it. And often I find writing it down is actually really helpful. So sort of, if this happens and this happens, my variation of introverted thinking is usually to write it out.
So I guess sometimes you're trying to come up with a plan, and then you go, right, I've got the plan. She's like, I've done it already, Rob. I've completed the task.
If you're looking for raw productivity, I don't know that you can beat ESTJ, as having witnessed her capacity over the last 16 years. So the amount of things that they're able to get done in one day is remarkable. I by contrast, work in bursts of inspiration. And so if I'm in a burst, the productivity is high, but it's not sustainable for the course of a 9-hour stretch.
It's great. So, and when you're working with people in organizations, what other really interesting clashes come about in communication? What do you see the biggest issues with?
So it's funny, it's a list. There's quite a few. Often, all right, so I'll make a couple of generalizations. So the first is, it often stems from an individual at odds with his or her organizational culture. So someone who doesn't fit. So we have a number of organizations, for example, that are highly feeling organizations. So the first priority on joining that organization is building relationships. Informal connections in the hallway are actually the currency within certain of these organizations. And for really strong thinking types, so think about your ENTJs, your ESTJs. This is so counterintuitive to what their historical experience has been professionally, and also their impulse from a personality type perspective. And so that's often where we're going to see some really major flashpoints. When I'm working with executives in a coaching capacity, it's often to help them unpack why they feel at odds with that cultural element, and then give them some sort of tips on how to navigate it. Then the next generalization I'll make is actually not dissimilar to the challenge that Carly and I face. My personal belief, it's not done by a survey, is that more than 50% of workplace conflicts occur between the NTs and the SJs. It's a substantial organizational challenge. The NTs, if you think about it, and I'm just using my short-term shortcut for it. So the NTs are pushing for innovation in the new, and they want to drive things towards that future vision. The NS are doing the same thing, but they're putting a lot of energy into the relationship maintenance and making sure that they're bringing people along with that. The SPs are like, well, all right, if that's where we're going, great, fine, no big deal. They don't typically fight the new because they're open to those new experiences. Then the SJs are going to say, well, hang on, what you're suggesting is an unknown. And by nature of the unknown, we have risk. We're also being asked to let go of a number of existing policies and procedures or practices that we know work and we feel comfortable with. And so how do we reconcile those two? And the SJs are not necessarily going to be shy from having that conversation. So often that's where the clash emerges from. And organizations will often shift between being primarily NT or primarily SJ as they go through a sort of an evolution as their business grows.
Do you find, I mean, as even going on to another level, are the SFJs likely to conflict? Is it the STJs that are more getting into actual arguments and so on?
So what's interesting is this is my observation, so just one man's opinion. I find that the SJ is stronger than the thinking and feeling preference when their responsibilities at risk. So if an SJ, regardless of the other flavors, extrovert, introvert, or thinker, feeler, is feeling as though their core values are at risk, you're going to see the SJ emerge regardless of the other preferences. And so I would say that if that's the case, then it doesn't matter if they're SFJ or STJ. The sort of fringy stuff where it's maybe not a core values piece, then yeah, I think that would be where it would start to emerge differently. And you know, an SFJ would likely work through the relationships to express their concerns and find a diplomatic element if they're really listening to that part.
So do you really see sort of in your work like evidence to support the way that the temperaments were split up and allocated in the sense that intuition goes with thinking or feeling, like NTs and NFs, but then you've got the SJs and SPs?
I really find that if we're talking from practitioner perspective, people often ask, like, how clearly do you see evidence for the hierarchy of functions? How clearly do you see evidence for these various different sort of parts of the trade? The temperament piece is, for me, perhaps the most consistent and trustworthy of the whole framework. Like, I just see so much within that. And when we get at those core values, it really does appear to be consistent on sort of an international, multicultural level as well, which is quite fascinating to consider.
And so when you're looking at different cultures, you talked before about people being at odds with the culture. You know, what's the sort of prevailing US business culture that you're seeing right now, or does it vary a lot from organization to another?
Organization to organization, industry by industry, and then globally. Lots of variation. And this is one of the sort of fun parts for me is I would not have guessed that starting out this journey 16 years ago, that there would be that much diversity of organizational cultures and who can be successful within those organizational cultures. So, I mean, you can generalize, and this is probably the most risky generalization so far, that, you know, men in the US are expected to be STJ, and women are expected to be some form of SFJ. That's a tough generalization. The business elements are different, right? And then you start to get into some of these, I think, quite fascinating sort of dimensions where it's, you know, a thinking woman who's going against the expectation for a feeling behavior, but is within a culture organizationally that wants to see thinking behavior. And so it's getting a lot of mixed messages about, yes, we like what we see, but we want you to stop being that way. We're going to promote you, but we need you to be softer and nicer about it. It's a really interesting tug of war and mixed messages that they get, in the same way that a feeling man will often feel a similar conflict in terms of, you know, what they're being told they quote unquote should be like. I'm just going to close my window because someone's deciding to mow the lawn right next to me.
It's all right. It's an interesting time of year to be doing such work.
Well, here in Florida, it's always time to mow the lawn. So.
Oh, okay, fair enough. Yeah, you've probably got like those irrigation systems and like artificial sunlight and things like that, I guess. Yes.
Indeed.
So the where were we? So yeah, going back to, we were talking about how people like women with a thinking preference, men with a feeling preference might perhaps feel like they can't win in a sort of situation with multiple expectations. Who else can't win in our world today?
Well, so anyone, depending on their context, right? So one of the projects that I hope I'll be able to complete in the next few years, it involves this concept of permission, and it's giving ourselves permission to be who we are, And what I mean fundamentally in the context of the personality type community is to operate consistently with my type as much as I can. And so if I'm in an environment that says, you're not supposed to be like this, right? So let's take judging and perceiving. It's less charged, right? If I'm a perceiver growing up in a judger family, right, then from a very young age, I've been taught, I'm supposed to be this way, even though my natural impulse is to be different. How do I then reconcile that as I move through my life? When you get into the definition that people have for their own success, often you unpack a lot of those shoulds, that messaging. And then there's often an inconsistency between an individual's definition of success, which has been handed to them by their family, their culture, their education, and what they would do if they were left to their own devices. And I'm speaking purely just to their type. So an ESFJ who has been told throughout her life that going into finance is what the family considers to be success. And then suddenly realizes that they're spending 10, 12 hours without any human interaction working on spreadsheets. And it's not that they can't do the work, but they're wondering why is there no satisfaction for it? And the answer is, at least in part, because you're not utilizing your natural personality at least sufficiently to feel energized. And I want to, part of the dialogue that I hope will be part of the type community's contribution is how do we give that person permission to follow a path that may be different than what her family expectation is.
Do you think it is literally like close family, parents? Is that where most of this conflict comes from in your experience?
Yeah, I mean, I think, part of it's Hollywood, part of it's the media, part of it's our education. Religion can play a role. Different cultures have different expectations. Oh, you need to be a lawyer, you need to be a doctor. There's a cultural definition of success. Oh, he's smart, so he should be, right? And the shoulds start to pile up. It is complicated, right? So, you go across gender lines and you see a different set of expectations, generational differences in terms of expectations. But yeah, when people start to unpack where that stuff comes from, a lot of it is on the parenting side. And so my personal belief is if we can give our kids anything, it's the permission to pursue a life that's sort of consistent with who they fundamentally are.
Yeah, I think that's a really important thing. I'm hoping that people who are type aware are helping their own children in that regard. I do try to do it consciously. I know that. Probably got an ISFJ daughter. She's only 2. Obviously, can't have a deep, in-depth conversation with her about it yet. But incredible memory, incredible introverted sensing, sort of real, sort of prodigious kind of thing with that. So, if we're trying to help people to kind of follow their inner dream, so to speak, rather than chasing something external, how could we achieve that? Especially with all of, like you said, like Hollywood and the culture itself being so prevalent.
Well, it's hard to go against that social expectation. You pick up what I call turbulence, which is feedback that you're not supposed to do that. So a great example for me was when I decided to leave the practice of law to pursue my career in personality type. Candidly, a lot of people thought I was crazy. You've invested 3 years of your life in school. You've been practicing law for 5 years. You still have debt from school, and you're making a top salary. Why would you, from a just purely looking at it on a paper, it doesn't make any sense to leave that for a complete unknown. And yet, when you factor in the other variable, which is my type, I was only spending 10% of my day doing the things that I would find naturally energizing. And I don't think that's healthy. I think that the bigger risk for me than leaving was staying in that environment and getting locked into it. But yeah, the turbulence you hear when you make a decision like that is a real factor. So the insulation against that is, to become more aware of yourself, through the language of personality type and other things. And then to surround yourself with people who don't share that traditional message, to find your tribe, people who are going to support you on the alternate path. It's part of why I feel that the type community has so much value. Practitioners report that not only has it been valuable from a professional perspective, but the validation you get by understanding yourself through this framework and then connecting with other people who've had the same realization, I think is powerful. And people will often reflect back on their allegiance and sort of association with type communities like BAPT and say, this was my tribe. these are my people, more so than my family, more so than my friends. So finding people who share that same awareness and understanding, who can support you and sort of bolster you against that turbulence you're going to face, would be a number one thing.
Mm. Your tribe. So where did you find your tribe?
Well, I'm fortunate. So my wife was very supportive, and also, a practitioner. So she understood that, just on paper, ENTP in that context was going to be a stretch for too long. I also work a lot through role models. So I look at examples of people who are, an ENTP who's found success in this path can be a much better guidepost for me than, just another partner at a law firm who, I didn't really associate with or feel drawn towards. So my tribe wasn't too hard. I married her. But I also, she'll tell you, I collect ENTPs, people who are the same type preferences as me. I'm curious about what they're working on. I try to support them. I look for the same support back when I'm in an uncertain place about life decisions, or, what am I doing? Am I crazy? And then there's one more piece of advice I can throw in there. It's not my advice. It's actually from a woman who wrote a book called Making a Living Without a Job, which I highly recommend. Barbara Winter. She's hilarious. She's like, when you're getting advice from someone, ask yourself, do you want to be that person when you grow up? And if the answer is no, then you just say, consider the source. This is not a source that I want to listen to, right? So if your uncle is giving you a hard time over the holidays about your career or life choices, but you don't want to be your uncle when you grow up, then just discard it, right? It's just chatter, it's just noise. And chances are the people who are giving you the advice that doesn't resonate are giving you advice that would be perfect if they were the recipient, right? So an ESTJ who's giving me as an ENTP advice is probably giving great ESTJ advice. It just happens to miss because we're not coming at the world from the same perspective.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Did you find your kind of ENTP mentor along the way?
It's funny because ENTPs, we don't believe in hierarchies, right? So there's no mentor, mentee. There's just shared, open, and I thrive on that. So I'm throwing my answers in. I'm taking as much as I can out. I've got a cadre of people who I've sort of brought around me. Many of whom were not, interested or aware of personality type, who've now gotten certified and become passionate about it as well, which is kind of fun to see them go through the realization of how valuable this understanding can be from that self-bolstering perspective to stand up again. I mean, the less common types need this more than anyone else, right? If you pick up any book, it's not written for your type most likely. It's written for a larger audience that may or may not include yours. So it's hard to find the guidance and support that speaks to your own specific needs.
So, having sort of made that big decision to leave your old career and sort of forge a new path, how did it all start? Like, how did you actually begin this journey into TypeCoach?
Yeah, we thought it was going to be a lot easier. No, my wife and I said, all right, so how hard can it be to get, one client per month? That's all we need. And then we can break even on our expenses. So we sold a very nice place in downtown Boston, move out to the suburbs, put some cash in the bank, and said, we've got 18 months where we don't need to make any money, so we can just go after it. And it took about 18 months. So yeah, it's very difficult to build a practice in this space. There's just a lot of inertia in the marketplace. But we also found out that we liked it. The actual process of going out and getting new clients, I enjoy that. I know a lot of practitioners don't, but it's sort of like convincing someone of why I'm right is natural to an ENTP. So I just channel that towards the sales process. And Carly's great at making sure that we follow through and we have the processes and systems in place. So yeah, I would tell anyone who's considering the path to budget more time for it to take off and sort of become break even or before profitable, and then see where it goes from there.
And so when you started developing and selling your interventions and things, how did you find selling a type-based system to companies, given that there's negative stuff out there about type and things, and people hear all sorts of things, and some people might have not, we talked about before about fatigue, some people might not have had such a good experience with type sometimes. We know that there's a lot of people out there who it's not been done particularly well, or they just haven't had the time to get to the real nuggets and the real sort of learning from it, the real application. So how do you find that's the process of selling that?
So it's interesting. So the Adam Grants and the Malcolm Gladwells, the sort of naysayers, have had far less impact than I thought they would. So the impact is not really something that the decision makers within our organizations fret about. It's just not a concern for them. Where it shows up is in the initial skepticism that the participants will have in the session. I just did a session for Genomics England, right? So we have highly scientific audience, mostly PhDs. I asked them to, in the chat before the virtual session, on a 1 to 10 scale, how skeptical would you say you are about this topic? And there were a number of 8, 9s, and 10s. And that's where that naysaying went. It went into that sort of mainstream scientific community that was already eager to be skeptical anyways. But it doesn't affect the decision maker. So we're in there doing the work, and we just have to navigate that as practitioners. And I can speak to that. But I was surprised that there would be as limited an effect as there was. The fatigue is much more of a factor. Like that is really, we've done Myers-Briggs 5 times, why would we do it again? Or we used to do that, and now we do DISC, we do something else. Quite common. And I think that's partly because of the lack of application at the end of that session, and also the repetition, right? Just having done it enough times without seeing sort of the value associated with it. So that fatigue is much more of a headwind for us than anything else.
Mm. So when you're going straight into the application, because you've kind of, as you said, you put a lot of the pre-work as what would have gone into the sessions in the past in interventions. What are you seeing, let's say with a skeptical audience, how is the impact for them when it's applied in that way?
So the skeptic, first of all, don't deny the skepticism is my advice. And as an NTP, I'm naturally skeptical. So I'm embracing the challenge. I'm looking forward to that debate by nature. I want them to sort of kick this around and see if it holds water. My only request at the outset, and it's my very first slide when I have a known to be skeptical audience, is, hold off on your skepticism and ask yourself whether what I describe matches with your own experience first. And if it matches with your own experience, then we're good. I don't need to establish anything more than this is true from your own experience, and try out the techniques that I offer and life will get better. So I set a very low bar on what I'm trying to accomplish. I'm not trying to establish that this is a scientifically proven system. I'm simply saying, if you try this out with your introverts, life is going to get better, I promise you. And so try it. And that's usually, it just sort of diffuses the intensity of the debate, which is, most of the debate is about what the traditional approach has laid claim to, not about whether or not the framework itself exists and is viable. And so if we can prove to them through their own eyes that the system is actually real and they can actually use it, then the skepticism sort of is easily sidestepped.
Mm. Well, you're right. It's a model that's been built from observations of real people in real life and trying to describe and explain that. And, that's what you say, that is the end thing that you should compare it with, ultimately, That's
my belief. Until we have fMRI, data where we can point to the sensing and intuition wiring difference in the brain, we don't have that yet. So we have to talk about, we can perceive this difference, and you can feel this when you're talking to your spouse or your kids or your boss. And so if it's real enough for you to act upon in those contexts, then it's real enough for me.
Mm. We had a question from Amy. It was, what recommendations do you have for getting an organization to embrace type beyond the initial delivery?
Thank you, Amy. So for me, the alignment with a broader issue the organization faces is really key. So if I go in, and what I'm really saying is, don't sell personality type. Personality type is the how, right? And the practitioner needs to know the how. The client doesn't need to know the how until we're in the engagement. The client needs to know what are we going to deliver upon? And if they've already identified as a strategic priority, a massive change and transformation effort, like this is the single most important thing, this is what's keeping management up at night. How can we align with facilitating that process? We're going to make that happen faster. We're going to save you money along the way. We're going to make it easier, or it may in fact be the single biggest difference between it happening or it not happening. In which case, now they need to have it, whatever that solution is. And then we say it happens to be a communication system, in our case, based on personality type. Okay, great. As long as you're delivering on that promise, I don't really care. So it's that broader strategic priority with the organization. If we can create that alignment, diversity and inclusion, emotional intelligence, change and transformation are some of the biggest things that our clients have said. If we can improve communication, we'll achieve that objective, and we must have that.
What sort of pain points and symptoms are they seeing usually when these things are coming up?
So it's funny. So diversity and inclusion is, they recognize that they're not nearly as nimble and adaptable as an organization, as they need to be as an organization, which means that either they have a preponderance of certain personality types, or, and this is more likely, they really only encourage certain voices to be heard. And so we've had a number of organizations say, we have a lot of smart people. Why aren't we more innovative? Why do we have to, go buy this company that's created this new technology when we have people who are just as smart inside our company? But the reality is the people inside that company who have those ideas are not encouraged to voice it. The organizations typically, especially the larger ones, are much more focused on consistency of process, stability of a production line, and all this stuff. So the new and innovative concepts are not sort of encouraged as much, even though my guess is that there's sufficient people of different personalities to touch on those. So it's how do we sort of encourage people and create the space for them to participate, as one example.
Do you find your sort of interventions have helped people to be able to speak out and be more active when they were afraid to speak?
I hope so. Yeah. I mean, our clients report back to us, if we take something as basic as one of our sort of chestnuts, sort of the big learning pieces in the extrovert introvert segment, is that we believe that introverts do their best thinking on complex matters when they have somewhere between 2 and 48 hours to sort of absorb and process. So how do we integrate that in a fast moving business? And in the US, and to a certain extent, the UK, the expectation at the end of a meeting is that we've come to a resolution and a plan of action has been put in place and we're going to act upon that. But the reality is 2 days later, your introverts are coming up with a new version of that. So how can we recycle their ideas back into our final action plan and capture the benefit of that preferred thinking style for roughly half the population? So that's low-hanging fruit. That's just, extrovert, introvert. We're not even talking some more sort of meaty, robust examples in sensing and intuition. But if we can incorporate the introverted perspective, we're going to get a lot more ideas and a higher quality if we produce that space for them.
No, that's great. Yes, you say even at any different level of looking at the model, that you can make quite big differences with just a small understanding of change of how you do things. But another question was again from Amy. So it says, do you find the same types or opposites tend to have more conflict? Does it differ at work versus at home? I suppose, do you talk about home or not?
We actively encourage people to talk about home all the time. And the reason why is very simple, because they're going to do it anyways. So, what's funny is the dimensions are typically, the elements are the same, right? So it might be more emotionally charged, or sort of other components may come in at home, but it's the same element, right? So if you're a strong thinking type and you're struggling with someone on the feeling side, whether it's personal or professional, the solution is going to look fairly similar, which is, I need to take a more empathetic, supportive approach before I get into my solutions. And that's going to be true if I'm a manager supporting someone who's a feeler who's going through a tough spot, or it could be my spouse. So that the dynamic will be the same, but obviously how I navigate it will be different. I was coaching this gentleman a number of years ago, super thinker, right? And culturally had not been softened, had been encouraged really to be as thinking as possible. And so recognizing that his boss was a feeler and a number of key colleagues in his peer group were feelers, gave him significant pause, because he recognized that his path forward required learning a whole new skill set. And he felt quite concerned about doing that at work the first time. Just he wanted some practice. So his wife was saying, "What are you doing? Like, you're being super," and she gave a number of characterizations for how he was starting to interact with her friends and certain other family members, because he was trying to practice a different approach. He was trying to practice what it was like to be more empathetic, to be more, what he considered to be the best approach for connecting with the feeling types before he felt comfortable to then bring it back into the office. I don't think it's a bad idea, to get some practice before you start applying it to your boss or whomever.
Yeah, it's a good idea. Yeah, don't just do it for the first time in an important meeting. Like,
there's probably one more element in Amy's question though. So certain similar types tend to clash more than others, right? So so your ESTJs and your ESTJs one-to-one, even though they have a lot in common, you're going to see some clash in the same way that you'll see with an ENTJ and an ENTJ, or an INTJ and an INTJ. But that's not to say that it's a TJ challenge, because you can have feeler fights as well. So dominant feeling types trying to come in over the top on one another. No, I'm so sorry. No, I'm so. You can see some of those conflicts emerge as well when you have similar types. I would say that what's interesting to me is that if I talk about my exact opposite, so ISFJ, there's not actually usually a lot of conflict that comes from our mirror, our sort of four-letter opposites. I have a harder time with types that are, don't express their functions in the same order that I do. So I have a harder time with ENTJs than I do with ISFJs, because our two middle letters are flipped, right? So they extrovert thinking and I introvert it, and I extrovert intuition and they introvert it. So we both have to do a lot of translation in that moment to make the connection on those two sort of flipped frequencies. So that's a little nuance I throw into that as well.
No, it's a good point. It's like Jung's observation that sort of the two opposite attitudes of the same function are like incessantly at war. There's a tension. You think just because you share the same basic function letter in MBTI or whatever that you get along, but actually, like you say, if they're opposite kind of introverted, extroverted versions, it can actually throw a whole spanner in the works. So,
yeah. Well, what's interesting is when I reflect on some of the other collaborations that I've enjoyed the most, it's often helping introverted intuitives express their intuition, right? So if you and I were collaborating, Richard, so you'd be like, yeah, I've got this thing that I'm trying to bring out. And I'm like, oh, I hear you. And then I'll say it. And you're like, how the hell did you say the thing that I've been trying to say? I'm like, well, that's what extroverted intuition is all about, is that the expression of it. Like, you formulated it. And if you can give me a little bit of it, I can pull that out and help you put words to it. I'm on the board of a company, the CEO is an INTJ. I just spent an hour with him today. And it's precisely the same dynamic. He's trying to, he's got it. It's up here. He can see it. He can experience it as crystal as anything. But then the articulation of it is a harder thing for him to do.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, and I know I'm married to an extroverted intuitive as well. So the thing for me that gets me is the like opening things up when I think we've already got things nailed. I mean, it's kind of the JP thing as well, really, but it's kind of really shows up in the extroverted intuition.
Oh yeah,
opening things up when they're already resolved. Oh, why don't we just why don't we do that? It's like, oh.
Nothing was ever resolved, Richard. You just thought it was.
Yes, like that's a lesson for me, definitely. So we're coming almost to the end as well, unfortunately. But so wondering if you've got any kind of things you want to plug or mention that you've got things you're offering, or things that you've got coming up that people might be interested in.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I love connecting with the practitioner community. I'll plug BAPT straight up. I believe it's the world's leading organization in our field. This is where the action is. So if you're not currently a member, you should be a member. The conference is going to be great. I'm looking forward to a couple presentations that I'm giving, but I have always enjoyed learning from the other presenters. Yeah, I'll be touching on a couple things we've got in our pipeline, including a collaboration with Angelina Bennett. So I know she's here as well. So that'll be fun. Yeah, the thing for me is I'd love to get feedback from the practitioner community on what we built. We've tried to build it with care. We tried to build it ethically and with purpose of making the practitioner community more relevant and valuable. And I'd love to share that with anyone who'd like to check it out. We're also, since the pandemic began, doing a virtual influence course, which is our sort of signature program. And we've been doing that on an ongoing basis, and it's free to all practitioners. So I invite all of you to contact me. If you're not linked in with me, please do so. And feel free to email me if you want to check out those other offerings.
Cool. And your website is?
TypeCoach.com.
Excellent. There we have it. No hyphens or anything. Did you change it recently?
Yeah, we dropped the hyphen. It was a company in the Netherlands that had the unhyphenated. We finally got it out of their clutches. So
wonderful. No, it's great that you've got it. Well, it's been really interesting talking to you, hearing about your journey and your work. Like I said, well, I'm looking forward to the conference massively as well, hearing what you've got to say. What was the subject of your talk?
I'm doing two. So the first is bridging the gap between the type community and the hundreds of millions of people who've been through a free quiz online. So how can we connect those two communities? And really for me, it's how do we establish our relevance to people who think they know what they need to know when in fact they've just touched the very surface of the topic. And then the second one is the one that I'm collaborating on with Angelina, which is a new version of our reports that will talk about type development, shadow behaviors, derailers, really going after what Hogan and a number of other sort of programs have touched on, coming at it from a Jungian Myers type perspective.
Great. Well, we all like a bit of the dark side, so that sounds really interesting. I look forward to seeing it. And thank you for sharing. It's been great to speak, and hopefully we'll see you again. So take care, Rob.
Thank you, Richard, and thank you everyone for joining. I really appreciate you spending the time with us.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. We'll see you soon. Take care. Bye-bye.